Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Donald Trump is now trying to make a comeback. He announced that he's running for president for a third time in 2024. His message remains the same. The former president pledges that he will make America great again.
Trump is still popular among base Republican voters despite the disappointing midterm results. CBN's Matt Galka reports.
America's comeback starts right now.
Donald Trump didn't waste much time to make his big announcement. Speculation about another bid for the White House came true as the former president announced a third try for the commander-in-chief spot.
In order to make America great and glorious again, I am tonight announcing my candidacy for President of the United States.
Trump spent part of his speech attacking the current administration and said America was in decline. He mostly stayed away from the 2020 election after claiming it was rigged and stolen from him for the past 2 years since his loss.
The United States has been embarrassed, humiliated, and weakened for all to see.
Trump formally filed paperwork for his 2024 candidacy. Meanwhile, President Biden tweeted during the announcement a video with the text, "Donald Trump failed America."
We will treat those people from January 6th fairly.
The unusually early announcement comes after lackluster results for Republicans in last week's midterm elections. After predictions of a red wave sweeping the House and potentially flipping the Senate, the GOP looks to gain only a bare majority in the House, and the Senate remains in Democrat control. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said the party didn't appeal enough to voters in the middle.
We underperformed among independents and moderates because their impression of many of the people in our party in leadership roles is that they're involved in chaos, negativity, excessive attacks, and it frightened independent and moderate Republican voters.
Democrats used Trump's messaging against many of his endorsed candidates throughout the midterms. It led to losses for some high-profile Trump picks.
The so-called GOP red wave turned into a red wedding for extreme MAGA Republicans and election deniers in race after race after race all across the country. Here's the Republican response. The cult leader should run again.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is perceived to be the top rival to another Trump nomination, but some analysts say they'll believe it when they see it.
It doesn't carry quite as much weight considering many of the highest profile endorsed candidates didn't do as well in these elections, but he's still the most popular person among base Republican voters. And until someone takes that away from him, he has to be regarded as the frontrunner.
The announcement comes as the former president is still dogged by plenty of legal challenges. In New York, the Attorney General filed a lawsuit alleging fraud in some of his business practices. He's also the subject of a probe in Georgia investigating his alleged attempts to possibly try and overturn the 2020 election. He's also failed to comply with a subpoena from the January 6th committee investigating the Capitol riots. Matt Galka, CBN News.
Well, CBN chief political analyst David Brody joins us now. So, David, what's your take on the launch? How did Trump do?
Well, let's start with this. I need to run and fulfill my prescription medications and get an upside in the dosage, I think, at this point, Gordon. I mean, here we go again. Where do I even begin with Donald Trump? Look, it was a pedestrian official announcement. I don't think it was anything earth-shattering necessarily. But look, I think the line that stood out to me, and it had nothing really to do with policy or public positions or anything, but what he said is that he believes, and he's gaming this out, he believes that America is actually going to be far worse in 2 years, in 2024. And that said a lot to me. So he's banking on the fact that America will be worse in 2 years, Joe Biden will be running, and he'll be on the ballot. He believes that, in essence, will be the trifecta as why people will say, look, enough is enough. And we'll see. And I got to tell you, we can get into the midterm elections here in a moment, but abortion, the overturning of Roe, in essence, won't be on the ballot, at least as much as it was in 2022, compared to the fact that Roe was overturned, and I think that was a big deal of what happened in these midterms. And so because of that, with Roe not being on the ballot, if you will, the overturning of Roe, I think that some things are lining up for Donald Trump here. The problem, Gordon, here for Donald Trump is, well, a couple things. January 6th happened, but after that, you got the mega donors that are interested in DeSantis, the GOP mega donors. You've got the Murdoch, conglomerate there, News Corps, in essence, kind of rooting for DeSantis. So you've got those two things going against you. And then it puts Trump in the underdog position again, which is a good thing. I just think it's going to be heavy lifting. But here's what I've learned in 25-plus interviews of interviewing Donald Trump and knowing him about 15 years. Never underestimate him. Never. It's exactly where he wants to be.
Well, he's in for a battle. It looks like DeSantis is polling well, so my guess is he'll likely run. There's the Virginia's Governor Youngkin, who may throw his hat in the ring. So are we going to look at a highly contested Republican primary if Biden chooses to run again, and all indications are he will? He won't be contested. So are the Republican candidates going to chew each other up in a primary? And what's going to be left for the general election?
I think we're going to see a highly contested primary. Look, on paper, it would make sense for DeSantis to run, but I think there's a lot of reasons that he might want to reconsider this. I mean, look, I understand why he would want to run, and there's a lot of people encouraging DeSantis to run after what he did in Florida and the numbers that he won by, and of course, he's kind of like the golden child right now. Having said that, here's one X factor, and the X factor all starts with Donald Trump. Ron DeSantis, if he runs, is going to have to go up against Trump. Now Trump is going to, as you know, rip DeSantis like you wouldn't believe. Just ask Lion Ted and Little Marco how that worked out for them. DeSantis will be branded exactly the same way, and here's the problem. A lot of folks will say, well, to Trump, say, hey, well, don't do that to DeSantis. The problem is, how will DeSantis react to this? If DeSantis gets in, he's going to have to attack Trump. If he attacks Trump, he's going to be attacking MAGA. If he attacks MAGA, that's not going to look good for DeSantis. So this is three-dimensional chess here. It's very interesting. It would make sense, you would think, for DeSantis to wait and have a clean slate, not go against Trump, because he might be tainted a little bit at that point based on the fact that he would have to come against Trump, which means coming against MAGA, which are the exact voters he needs to win the primary and potentially the presidency. Well,
I remember that same argument being played to Obama back in 2008. Why don't you just wait? And he said no. So we'll see. 2028 is a long way away. Let's go to the other side. Some are blaming Mitch McConnell for the poor performance in the midterm. Some are blaming Trump, but some are also blaming Mitch McConnell. So what's the case against Mitch, and could he lose the Senate minority leader?
I don't get a sense that he's going to lose the Senate minority leadership. I do sense that Kevin McCarthy on the House side could indeed not become Speaker of the House. Look, the case against Mitch McConnell is pretty simple, and it's twofold. Number one, he was aligned with a PAC, a political action committee, that did not put the requisite amount of money into the race in Arizona, the Blake Masters race, and he spent it elsewhere in Arizona, in essence, against some Republican candidates. Long story, but the bottom line is they're concerned about McConnell on that front, but also just more this idea of it's time for some new blood, some fresh blood. This idea that, you know, they look at McConnell and they look at this centrist thinking, this moderate thinking, this now is called rhino thinking, Republican in name only. And it's time for a whole change, do a whole different kit and caboodle. So there's that argument. But the problem is the Republican Party is trying to find themselves right now. And really, ever since Ronald Reagan, there has been the Republican Party has really kind of morphed into a much different party. It's not Ronald Reagan's conservatism anymore. As a matter of fact, you can make the argument, Gordon, that if Ronald Reagan was running in a primary today, he'd be considered a Republican in name only. He would be considered a rhino. That's how far the Republican Party has gone in a certain direction. They are more of that right-wing nationalism, or at least right-wing populism. Let's call it populism, because I think nationalism has a bit of a taint to it at this point. But it's a much different party, and I think Mitch McConnell's getting caught up in that.
All right. Well, let's go down to Georgia, and with the heat off on the control of the Senate, that's already decided. Does that favor the incumbent Warnock? Does Walker have a shot here?
Well, I do think it favors Warnock. I mean, I think the enthusiasm, if you will, is going to be tainted a little bit on the Republican side. I know the Republicans are going to say, look, we got to keep it at least 50-50, and that is true. But look, it kind of feels like a won't situation, kind of like the air has been let out of the balloon. The Senate is going to be controlled by the Democrats. So what's the motivation at this point? And of course, there are going to be Republicans that explain what the motivation is for Herschel Walker to win. And the only motivation I can see, what the Republicans can argue, is that if you keep it 50-50, at least you're 2 votes away. Remember, Manchin and Sinema, the 2 Democrat senators, are not going to vote to overturn the filibuster on a lot of different things. So if you're at 51, if you get to if Warnock wins, that puts the Democrats at 51. That puts them 1 away, if you will, or they only need 1 vote to change the filibuster, because you figure they can maybe get Sinema or Manchin. So it's one of those things, but I don't think voters are really paying much attention to the inside baseball stuff. So I think this hurts Republicans.
Well, I'm paying attention, and one of the great news is it's a divided Congress now. There's Republicans in charge of Congress and Democrats in charge of the Senate, and that means no legislation is going to get through. So they're not going to be able to change anything. There's good and bad to all of that, and the frustration is there's a lot of legislation that we actually need, but I don't see any bipartisan cooperation going forward. Well, David, thanks for your insights. Let's turn to Europe and what's going on in the Ukraine. What we're hearing now from the Polish president is that there's no evidence of a deliberate attack against Poland. And this is after a missile landed in his country that killed 2 people. As Brody Carter reports, the incident has raised concerns of a widening war.
Poland's president and the head of NATO say it appears the missile came from Ukrainian defense forces combating a barrage of incoming Russian missiles. Yesterday, President Biden suggested it did not come from Russia.
There is preliminary information that contests that. I don't want to say that till we completely investigate. It's unlikely in the minds of the trajectory that it was fired from Russia. But we'll see.
The incident initially causing fears of an attack on NATO territory, which could escalate into a wider war.
You can't imagine really that Russia would have wanted to shoot missiles into Poland, knowing that it would garner some sort of response when they're already on their back foot.
Overnight, U.S. officials telling the Associated Press that early assessments suggest it was a Ukrainian missile fired to intercept Russian missiles. In the aftermath of the fall of Kherson, Russia launched its most intense barrage, sending almost 100 missiles into western Ukraine, killing civilians and destroying homes and businesses. Determining what exactly did happen is crucial, as an attack on a NATO country could create a confrontation between nuclear powers. Article 5 of NATO states an armed attack against one NATO nation shall be considered an attack against them all.
The United States and our allies will defend every inch of territory that is NATO territory with the full force of our collective power. Every single inch.
The incident has raised tensions in the region.
If NATO countries aren't careful, and I'm seeing some, particularly in the Baltic countries, making some pretty bombastic statements describing this as an attack and dangerous escalation. Wars can quickly spiral out of control. We're talking about countries with nuclear weapons.
An unfortunate accident is what Poland's president is calling the 2 deaths from Wednesday's missile. He emphasized Ukraine is not to blame for trying to defend itself. Brody Carter, CBN News.
Well, and all the attention placed on this missile that landed in Poland, and whether it came from Ukraine or came from Russia, it's all part of the war. And could that war spill out over the borders of Ukraine? I think quite clearly it could. Let's all keep in mind how World War I started, and it started in the Balkans. And it's a series of treaties that were created where you are obligated to come to a defense of your ally. And so if this thing spills out into one of these NATO countries, you heard the president, he says, I'm going to defend every inch. And so he can't back from that. And are we on the brink of World War III? I hope we're not. I think the attempts now from both Poland and from our president to minimize it is showing just how afraid world leaders are that we could escalate into World War III. But what's underneath all of this and is being ignored because of a single missile in Poland is that Russia intentionally targeted the electrical generation and transmission grid of Ukraine, and they're doing it right before winter. They are trying to freeze the civilian population of a nation. That should be considered a war crime, and nobody's talking about that. Ukraine is going to go into a very cold winter with no source of power. And when you try to rebuild an electrical grid in wintertime, you are having a Herculean task. We should all pray for Ukraine, and we, for our own sakes, pray for peace in the region, that this doesn't become a much wider war.